Now, round about 120 years ago, all of this started to change. And it might be interesting to reflect here on the stages in which this transformation in the West's vision of education has unfolded. Because it seems to have undertaken a sea change every 100 years. Historians have noted how inconvenient this is from the perspective of those who use the Gregorian calendar, in that usually the sea change gathers momentum about 20 years before the turn of each century. Now, from our point of view, it's actually very convenient because it mirrors very closely the Hijri calendar. We might say that at the dawn of the 12th century, of the 13th century, the beginning of the 13th century, we really start to see the beginnings of the decline of the classic medieval Christian synthesis in education, of course mirroring larger transformations in society and philosophy and religion as well. So that round about the year 1200 in our calendar, we start to get the first voices raised explicitly against classical forms of religion, and also against a kind of classicizing Hellenistic tendency. Edmund Burke would be one example of this. On the European continent, the most clear expression of this at around the beginning of the 13th century was the French Revolution, with its radical denial of the traditional European Christian story. In England and in America, by extension, another key figure here was Gibbon, with his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was one of the first works really to challenge the educative value of Christianity. His question was, did Christianity actually contribute to the collapse of that great unified civilization? Was it in fact an educative force at all? So at the beginning of the 13th century, you can say this is the change that was happening in the West. At the beginning of the 14th century, say around the 1880s, we find another major transformation taking place. And here, Darwinism is really gaining momentum for the first time. Freud is beginning to articulate his very secular deconstruction of the human spirit as being basically a product of the basest passional forces in the human subconscious. We find the development of forms of modernism in art and the beginnings of the Impressionist movement, and the move away from the idea that art has to be a celebration of beauty and symmetry, because that's the nature of the world, given its divine origin, and towards a more chaotic, revised, pessimistic view of the natural order and of the human form, culminating with people like Cézanne, for instance, and the high Impressionist period. Also, at the beginning of the 1300s, we find communism. Karl Marx writing Das Kapital, and communism and hardline forms of socialism are really gathering strength in the West. This is the time of Bernard Shaw's first writings. It's the time of William Morris's conversion to socialism, the Fabian movement getting underway. Not just communism, but also socialism in the real red traditional sense. And that goes on for 100 years, and then all of that falls apart as well. There was a skepticism about the skepticism. And we find that at the beginning of the 1400s, communism suddenly collapses. The Berlin Wall comes down in, 1989, but the rot has been clear for at least 10 years following the Soviet debacle in Afghanistan and Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, glasnost, and the rest. We find postmodernism starts to replace modernism with a more categoric rejection of the idea of the intrinsic meaning of any talk about anything. The idea that everything that we perceive in the world is not authentic, but is simply our own perception of something that is objectively unmeasurable. We also find, again following the postmodernists, the decline of the modernist idea of returning to point zero, each of these earlier transformations that coincided with the beginnings of different Muslim centuries had represented for the European consciousness, as it moved away from God and away from truth, the extension of the Protestant model of returning to the source, away from a biblical text and towards history itself, so that everything had to redefine itself in terms of point zero. Communists and the French revolutionists and the artists and the architects all wanted to go back before civilization and to reinvent everything from scratch. In the case of architecture, this was manifested in the mid-20th century, I suppose, mid-14th century, with people like Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus movement, and the complete rejection of the traditional forms of Western architecture, an attempt to return to pure form as facilitated for the first time by the invention of modern materials. With the beginning of the 15th century, our 15th century, we find modernism has been discredited, partly because there seemed to be something too programmatic and idealistic about the return to point zero, and the fact that people found its sterility uncongenial. And there was an attempt to open what one architect, Richard Merkin, has called the big closet. That is to say, we can learn from the past, and the past in all of its forms, whether the Romanesque or the Byzantine or the Moorish or the Hispanic or whatever, all there in the big closet of human civilization, and we can take out of that closet those things that happen to amuse us. So with Robert Venturi and Richard Rogers and a number of more explicitly postmodern architects, we find that the Western city, which shapes the Western soul, inevitably influencing our souls as well, is no longer modernist but postmodern, but that much further away from tradition because these forms have been stripped of any sacred meaning that they might once have had. Similarly, with the end of the 1300s, we find the collapse of socialism in the West, motivated in part by the disillusionment with the communist and hardline socialist project, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, published in 1973, and now the complete collapse of any serious socialism anywhere in the Western world. Tony Blair's New Labour is not socialist at all. It's Labour without the socialism. It's a very postmodern kind of concept. In fact, it's a kind of straightforward social democracy. So these are the stages through which the West's culture has evolved, and the West's education has reflected this. In the post-Burkean world, we find that no longer was education explicitly dictated by purely sacred or Christian concerns, but it was more about personal growth, and there was a rediscovery of the Greek idea of greatness of soul, of human completeness as being the function and purpose of education. There was still a certain transcendentalism attached to it. It was believed that human beings through education can become noble as well as useful. So Alfred North Whitehead said that education is the transmission of culture to enable individuals and society to attain a quality of life which is always beyond the mere fact of life. There's still, despite his very vague theism, the process metaphysics that he espoused, an idea that this was about making us more than mere cogs in a cosmic or social machine.